Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much. We are now going to go into our roundtable discussion, so our final event of the summer school. So this is a great opportunity, for those of you who may not have been able to be here for the full day yesterday, a great opportunity to ask questions of all of our speakers. But for those of you who were, again, another opportunity for you. So I'm going to be joined now by and I love this phrase, I've never heard of it before, our keynote listener, Professor John Barry, who was our main speaker yesterday. So thank you for coming back. And our other panelists, Anne Ryan, Clive O'Neill, Sean Healy, Tom McDonnell, and Colette Kane. So if we can have everybody spotlighted and back into our panel. It looks like it's just going to be you. John, you are going to give us some views on everything that we've heard in the last day and a half. But before you do, I want to poke the bear a little bit and ask you about one of the phrases that Colette used this morning. And I really liked it, and it actually made me think of you. It was, did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? And I think, again, something that Sean touched on yesterday was we're really seeing an attack on democracy at the moment, not just internationally, but here as well, where we've got a big lack of real social dialogue. And we're seeing particularly the environmental pillar, the community and voluntary pillar, being, I suppose, weakened, or at least their capacity to engage being weakened. Is it time for, I know the answer to this before even asking, is it time for protest?
It's time for a revolution, as I think I put in the chat yesterday. And just to share my reasons for that is that, as I mentioned yesterday, I'm a socialist. It actually is even worse than that. I'm a Marxist. I fundamentally believe that the current system that we have is incompatible with preserving life on Earth. Now, that's a very hard and easy thing to say at one and the same time. And for me, it's the reasons why Marxism should be understood, particularly for the audience this morning, is a Christian heresy. It has the same arc as Christianity in terms of, the fall and redemption. And what I like about Marxism and left-wing politics is it has a redemptive dimension to it, which I think is one of the themes that I've picked up from our discussion. How do we redeem ourselves as stewards in the eyes of God? How do we become, good ancestors to those who are yet to be born and come after us? And I am frustrated, as come as no surprise, at the timidity with which academics and indeed most of our citizens, those involved in the policy community, our political class, are not understanding the severity of the challenge that we face. But it's also, just to finish, it's also the tremendous opportunity that awaits us to create a different world. I mean, that's the real issue that, again, has come out in our discussions, the importance of hope and a positive vision of the future. But we have to start naming capitalism as the fundamental driver of our ecocidal system, and reminding ourselves that actually the current economic system is very, very new. Why on earth do we think that it's going to last forever? So for me, we do need to inform our action by the types of discussions we've had today that cover science, that cover ethics, politics, and economics. But it's the issue, Colette, that you've been quite rightly holding our feet to the fire through over the last 2 days. What is the action? For me, there's multiple ways we can to act in this way. There's community gardens that's getting involved in, renewable energy projects. But fundamentally, we cannot avoid the political struggle that is going to be, in my view, should be non-violent. We need mass protests. And it does strike me that on the island of Ireland, we're not very well placed, because a lot of our political tradition is that when we're faced with a challenge, I'm reminded here of what happened when effectively the Republic of Ireland was colonized by the European Central Bank during the post-crash era in 2008-09. the response of people was not mass protests. It was to take the pain. And it's almost like that's part of, I don't know, a peculiarly Irish, maybe even a Catholic mentality, that it's the absorption of pain that shows how resilient we are, as opposed to what you might call a righteous indignation that we should rise up and demand much better of the state and our politicians. So that's the revolutionary call to arms, comrades. And so I'll either see you in the trenches or the victory parade.
Sorry, of course I couldn't unmute myself there. But yeah, absolutely. I think that is quite the call to action. And I think it's a good, I suppose, introduction in terms of this roundtable, that call to action, that idea that, now we've had the discussion in terms of all of the different presentations that went on. We've heard from the experts. You're still here. So what next? What do we do next? How do we engage for the change that we've all acknowledged that we need to see? And it's great that, this panel consists of so many different views, so many different approaches to things, but with the same goal in mind. So with the expert heads, how do we make the change? What do we need to do? You all shy?
I thought John was going to give a longer response that we were. So, well, I just like to follow, because you did ask the question how, many times, Colette, and just to come back to what John said on that. Yes,
I'm childlike in my tenacity. I would say.
Keep shoveling the shit, to find the pony. But the systems theorist Margaret Wheatley has a theory of systems change, the two-loop system, so that while one system is dying, the other is growing or developing. And she says we need to look at where we are in the system, and some of us might be in a space where we do hospicing. So what we do is we look after people who've been really badly treated within the present system and who are suffering. So like that might be anything from working with refugees to, anyone who's suffering. Then she says there are also people who are kind of saying it's really time to move on. They're pioneering. So they're starting up the new projects. They're right out there on the barricades. They're putting their necks on the line, their bodies on the line. Like they're not doing the resting. They're really, really working hard to create new things like energy projects, projects around democracy, the farms. And Tom and I have both been members of a community-supported farm, the same one. So he'll know how much hard work is involved in that kind of thing, really working hard, energy projects, all the rest. So they're the pioneers and they really need support. And so some of us then are also in more powerful positions in society within the system. We might be in academics, we might be in trade unions, we might be politicians. So we need to kind of host and support the pioneers, invite them in, create spaces for them. I think Michael D is good at doing that sort of thing, but that's just one example. And then there's a role for people in cultivating the imagination, which is a theme that has come up all the time. There's a role for us as educators and visionaries and inspiring. And that's not meant to be a comprehensive list, but I think we can all say, well, I have a role, I can take up work in one of those categories or something else that I haven't mentioned. And that's not to say we don't, you can't be doing more than one of them, but I think there is some need, like, where do we take that first step? When someone's saying John the Baptist, yeah, exactly, crying in the wilderness sometimes. And those people really suffer because they actually are often in very, very precarious situations in society. And that's where, say, the work of Social Justice Ireland in promoting, and all of us in promoting the social wage and basic income, that's the kind of thing that can really, really support those people financially as they're putting their necks out there. And because actually also the work that they're doing represents a lot of the future work that is going to be needed in society. But right now, there aren't any jobs to match that work. So there's a mismatch between the jobs available and the work that needs to be done. So if we could kind of keep those pioneers going until such time as maybe there is pay available for that work, it would be wonderful. So I'll halt there. There's loads more I could say, but I want to hear what the others have to say as well.
Thank you, Anne. And actually, you drew on something there that I noticed as a common thread between John and Tom and Sean yesterday when we talked about the value and valuing unpaid work, and just how valuable that is, and how valuable that has proven to be, not alone for the Exchequer in terms of the cost savings involved when you go to the community voluntary sector, or the fact that there's unpaid labour in childcare and elder care, but also in terms of recognizing it, in acknowledging it, and valuing it in that way, and how important that is. And I'm going to put the question to all of you, but predominantly to the three that I just mentioned. And I'm going to put the same question again, is the how. How do we get to that space where it is valued, because it is so valuable?
I'll have a go, if that's okay. If I might backtrack, because this actually will feed into the answer. But I just want to take up one of John's points about we accepted the pain after the crash back in the bank, when the banks got bailed out and so on. I think that's a very educational kind of thing. By the way, I don't think it has too much to do with Christianity, really. I think it has to do with the tremendous effort that went in to socializing us into accepting what was in fact a false narrative, and leading, like there were all sorts of different strands to it, but there are moments that stood out. For example, Enda Kenny, just after he became Taoiseach, went off to Davos and basically said, we partied, and now we have to pay. Now that was untrue. Some people partied. The society might have been seen as partying, but in actual fact, there was a sort of we actually, a lot of people had not benefited hugely from the Celtic Tiger. Now, I think what we need to recognize, this is why I said can be educational. One of the things that happened during that time was the Troika came to Ireland 12 times in 3 years. Now, Social Justice Ireland met them face to face 12 times in those 3 years. Here in Dublin, we also met them via video links to Washington, to the IMF headquarters, and to the European Commission in Brussels via that sort of mechanism as well. Now, the interesting thing was that we produced briefings and so on every time we met them, and we published those. Almost none of them got into the media in the sense of no coverage whatsoever. Although the IMF in particular, who acted as the chair really in practice of the Troika, they actually bought a lot of the analysis. And you can see it actually subsequently more than during the time where they acknowledged that they had got it wrong. And their own analysis, okay? Now, there's a bit of a learning there as well, because I think by hammering away with the research, with the results, and so on, we actually did manage to change minds at a fundamental level, okay? Now, we failed to change minds in the European Central Bank, but I wouldn't take too much negativity out of that, because they were an extraordinary outfit. They wouldn't even introduce the people who were at the meeting on their side of the table. They were really not communicating in any form, and they never spoke at any one of those 12 meetings, which was interesting, you know. But anyway, that's another day's work. I think the key thing is this: how do we have to persist, recognizing that at the core of the maintaining of the status quo is a kind of what I would call a cultural understanding, an understanding of the way things are and the way things ought to be, and how we go from where things are towards where things ought to be. that's holding the society together. It's the core meaning of the society. It's transmitted in the education system. It's transmitted in mass media. It is transmitted by religion. I mean, basically, education and mass media tell people this is the way things are, and religion tells people this is the way God wants it to be, basically. All right. Now, what we need to do, I think, is work very strongly at changing the understanding of the present or the vision of the future, or how we get from one to the other. Like, I think change comes from that core. Now, if we can start to generate change there, it provides the energy to do the political work that's required, which in turn leads to changing how resources are used and distributed, which in turn changes the relationships, which are the social structures. So and then in turn, that respects environment, climate, and so on. Okay. So I think the thing turns a great deal, for me anyway, on that sort of analysis of the present, the vision of the future, and how we get from one to the other. And that's why in Social Justice Ireland, we put a huge amount of effort into researching those kinds of ideas, the current analysis, ideas for the future, and how one might travel a different pathway from one towards the other. So I just offer that as a kind of a context, if you like. I totally agree with John that capitalism's day is done. I don't believe it's a viable alternative option in the long term. Okay, we certainly need an alternative. We need a new paradigm. We need to be working towards it and doing what we can to actually get it up there and running. And I like Anne's thing about working away at the different levels, if you like, and trying to get support for the people who are, and the efforts that are being made on the frontiers, if you like. Okay.
Thank you, Sean. Tom, capitalism's day is done. Discuss.
Well, yeah, I wish it were so, but I think like the Halloween movies, this particular villain is going to be constantly coming back. So I think, look, world history is going to move in cycles. Capitalism is going to constantly be something that's always waiting in the backgrounds, even if it is kind of pushed slightly to the side. I think it's important to discuss what a non-capitalist economy might look like, and like there are small wins that you can get which can kind of exhibit what an alternative might look like. And like I think this is one of the reasons why it's one of the very many reasons why I'm a huge fan of universal basic services, because effectively you decommodify entire markets. That's what you're saying. Public transport, childcare, education, health. You're basically taking the market away, and you're just saying, no, we're going to do this at effectively a collective level. That is actually a type of socialism. But so it's about decommodifying, but you have to show the success. You have to make it work, and you have to show that this leads to better outcomes. And that's, I think, in public transport, childcare sector, areas like that, elder care too, we can show better outcomes. And you because one of the reasons we are where we are is because of very, very successful and influential and charismatic economists that became influential in the wake of the Second World War. People like Hayek, Milton Friedman, Robert Lucas, all of these guys, very, very aggressive alpha males who became very dominant in the US Republican Party, British Tory Party, and their ideology effectively came to conquer the world economies from about 1980 onwards in the US and the UK, and then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the tempering that was there in other respects fell away. Now, that then basically became the narrative about how you deal with of course, it led to the global financial crash, of course, right? It also led to the globalization that led to Rust Belt outcomes in much of the United States and the UK, which ultimately leads to Trump and Johnson and so forth. But in terms of what Sean is talking about their narrative was so dominant within economics. I'll put it this way. A colleague of mine who was in the same year in college, we just finished a master's, he went to get a job in an Irish university. It was UL actually, The people, he brought up the word neoliberal in his conversation, and they just didn't have a clue what he was talking about. He didn't know the word. They didn't know the word because it just wasn't part of the education. And these were people interviewing. So these were like seasoned academics. These weren't just people who had just graduated. So it wasn't. There weren't alternatives. There were just economics was economics, and there really was a belief that that this was it. This was the way to development. That was just it. There were no alternatives. Not because they were against the alternatives. They just weren't even aware of them. And of course, we talk about comparative economic thought and economic history just not being part of courses, and indeed political economy as well. So what Sean was facing in 2008 was a group of people who just had no other way of really conceiving of how an economy could be designed. But one of the really important things that came out of that was there is an acknowledgement of the European Commission, part of the Troika, and acknowledgement of the IMF.
Sorry to interrupt you, Tom. When you move your head that way, we lose your sound.
Oh, sorry. I'll move closer. But I suppose the point is the European Commission, the IMF, and the OECD all have to various degrees acknowledged that they were wrong in 2008. And there have been improvements in academic departments. So the contrarian voices in the wind that were proven correct in many cases in 2008, that paradigm and that narrative that used to exist is now changed and changed forever. It's becoming something else. You don't know what it's becoming. But again, the COVID crisis has shown the importance of social insurance, the importance of the social wage, the fact that radical changes can swiftly be introduced and be successful, and that the only thing stopping them in many cases is inertia. Just through the EWSS, the PUP, all of the things that were done. So I am quite optimistic. We're currently, unfortunately, facing into a new crisis, a cost of living crisis now, and I think it's heartening that a lot of responses that are coming are related to that are in areas like public transport and free childcare and so forth. And I think it's about building up coalitions between groups like Social Justice Ireland, faith-based organizations, green organizations, trade unions, and the wider NGO community, and agreeing on the direction of travel, as Sean describes it, and then and indeed Anne, but how do we get to point B? How do we get to this better place without breaking all the eggs? And that's the point about the just transition. And it's about John talks about revolution, and I completely agree, but it can be a slow burning revolution in some respects. As long as we get there in 15 years' time or whatever it might be. How do you iteratively move there without breaking those eggs, I suppose, is the issue. And I'm particularly thinking about energy and about cost of living and about industrial sectors that are going to have to end. And like, how do we protect those workers? How do we protect those households? And I think we know how to do it, but the message that we give has to be one that doesn't scare all of those people. Because if we scare them, then we won't make them allies. In fact, we'll make them enemies. So I think the messaging is very, very important here. We know how to do it. Granted, some of the technological solutions haven't been worked out, but we broadly have a sense. So I'm very optimistic. I think it's important not to despair. It's not about one person. It's about thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people working together on these ideas and solutions and constantly hammering away, because eventually the edifice will start to collapse. And the small wins and the examples of success will provide heart and will eventually, hopefully, get us there. And I have discovered it is possible to convince people, even on the right, sometimes through logic and reason. Sometimes it is just ignorance. It isn't necessarily that they're partisan grand conspiracy or whatever it might be. The one-to-one conversations can be very, very useful.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to break for a second because we're going to be joined by Sive O'Neill, so she could be spotlit. Good morning, Sive. Still morning it is. Good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning. I think I got the time wrong. My apologies.
No problem.
I don't know what I did, but I'm here now.
Great stuff. If you could higher up your mic just a little bit, that would be great, or maybe go a little bit closer to your mic. It's just a tiny bit low.
So this is just
brilliant.
Earphones. Is that better?
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. We were talking, I suppose, about the how. You know, we've talked and we've heard from this panel of experts about what needs to be done, and really we're just engaging now about how can we go about it. And Tom picked up a really, I suppose, a really good point on the how, which is, we can't do what needs to be done if we scare the people we need to convince. And I think that's really important. I think a lot of, again, it's that kind of social media, and, it's not just social media, it's mainstream media as well. It's either this or it's that. There's no consensus. There's no deal to be done, no engagement to be had. How do we do, as Tom talks about, how do we build these relationships and these networks, and as Sean would reference them, these kind of social partnerships, this dialogue that we need. Can I ask for your view around that, please, Si?
Yes, well, obviously, I only came in there towards the end. I heard the end of Sean's contribution and Tom's. So apologies again for being late, but I think the theme of the debate is capitalism's day is done. And I just want to add a reference to another aged white American out-of-date male. Kenneth Galbraith wrote a book, I'm not sure when, is it in the 80s, called The Age of Affluence. And I just want to point to this because it's a real, I think, obstacle, at least coming from a Green perspective, where you have a growing body of the electorate, which is middle class, very locked into certain patterns of production and consumption, both relying on the economy as it is to sustain employment and standards of living, but also invested in it kind of culturally, the material sort of aspects of our lives and our culture. And that makes it very difficult for agendas like the ones we're talking about to reach people, because they are scary. They do suppose changes that might involve and might necessarily involve a certain drop in the standard of living. And that's at a time when, of course, the cost of living is spiraling. So I don't necessarily have an answer to this, but I just want to point to the fact that, a lot of social justice organizations and green groups as well, highlighting the sort of the challenges and the distributional impacts on the most vulnerable and marginalized, which is correct. But in fact, we're going to have to talk to the middle classes, and I'm not sure how to do that. I'm not sure how to reach people. Certainly, it's something that I struggle with, and I see a lot of my colleagues in environmental organizations wrestling with the sense that some of what is being proposed, whether it's the latte levy or parking restrictions or you name it, very modest changes that are designed to shift away from that kind of private, individualized provision of social goods to a more collective, low impact approach, whether it's in public transport or whatever. And the resistance that pops up is quite shocking sometimes. And I don't think it's going to get easier, notwithstanding all the proposals that are there, where there's huge government money now committed to active travel, for instance. But I think we're going to see a lot of resistance. So I think that we need to be really honest about what the challenges are, that there isn't even a consensus across society that a lot of these things are necessary, never mind desirable. And I'm not sure how to reach people. I wrestle with this myself. In terms of the sort of debate about capitalism itself, certainly from a green point of view, I think,
sorry, Said, can you hold the mic just slightly higher?
A little closer, yeah. From the green point of view, I'm obviously not speaking for any particular group or political party or anything. It's just a kind of my own view. But I do think there's many different strands of opinion from a strategy point of view about what the best way is. There is no doubt that radical transformation, system change is needed, and that requires a break from capitalism to something else. But it's more a question of organizational strategy. With climate change and the impacts of that and biodiversity loss just accelerating, a lot of activists don't know how to organize themselves in such ways to firefight those issues and at the same time make the case for the bigger changes. That involves, I think, a multi-scalar, multi-pronged strategy, and social movements don't generally tend to be that well coordinated, that you have higher level, more abstract arguments being made, and at the same time the activist group. If that's the case, there's tension between those 2 points of strategy, and it's not an easy topic within the movement, I would say, because people who are arguing for the system change forget the firefighting about climate change and cycle lanes, just focus on the economic system. Don't talk to the others. Then the others feel that the abstractions are taking the spotlight off these very immediate disasters that are awaiting us. So this is a real problem. It's a problem of coordination and organization within the movement. So any suggestions, welcome.
Great, thank you. I mean, I absolutely feel your pain when you talk about, how do you talk to, the ones who just don't understand. I mean, back in 2007, 2008, I worked in corporate tax restructures. And I was, arguing the point of what we are doing is morally wrong in this space, and hence the fact that I no longer work in that space. Colette, if I can come to you, please. Anthony Kelly has a comment. We have to have a personal conversion that will show we believe in a new way and a new future. And again, it's my usual question of the how, in terms of how we not only have that personal conversion, but we bring it into the community, into society, into the debate. You're mute.
Yes, I was just thinking, in the Antarctic, we call ourselves an ecological centre and an organic farm. It wasn't called a centre of spirituality. So that the idea being that there wouldn't be censure from church authority, and that we could have the conversations between spirituality and science. And there's the praxis, there's the theory and the praxis, the doing. I suppose I would be coming from the educational perspective of how to change mindsets through earth literacy, to try and to promote earth literacy. And it's the both and, it is the macro and the micro. I'm hearing the systemic analyst talking about the systems change, and also at the micro level. For example, I was trying not to drive very fast at 110 miles an hour, but I can tell you, driving up and down from Wicklow to Belfast, I've slowed right down to 90. And that is really, really, I see the difference in the petrol that I consume. The micro conversion in small ways, the energy, the renewables, getting into renewable energy, the biomass or the solar or the wind. Sean mentioned yesterday networking in the sense of public participation networks. And I think networking is obviously ecological. All of life is in a network, in a web of relationships. But networking and public participation networks and sustainable energy communities, they have sprouted up all around Ireland as well, to be part of a sustainable energy community and get the carbon footprint for the town, or to see how you can be converted and put that into action. But it is both and, micro and macro. Informing ourselves. Now, how we do that as educators, and I'm not sure the earth literacy. But sorry, I wanted to say, Gandhi, I believe, said if the world was going to end tomorrow, what would he do? And apparently he said he would plant a tree. So go out and plant trees.
Be like the children and go and plant trees. And I do think there's a lot to be said for the way children view the world. And again, I hold absolutely my hand up to the encouragement of the questions and the why and the why and the why and the why. And I think it's a real shame that we evolve into adulthood and we stop asking questions at a time when it's really important to do exactly that. Sorry, Anne. Yep.
No, that's great. Thanks. I'd just like to add to what Colette has said about literacy, ecological and earth literacy. We also really need economic literacy much more throughout society. we don't all have to be absolute experts, but we do need to have the basic literacy in what economics means. Because I mean, most people think it's just accounting, moving figures around the place. And I mean, even if you ask politicians questions about economics, that's very often the narrative behind their response. The framework within which they respond is about accounting. And like Pascal Donoghue, it's like, if anyone listens to Scrap Saturday, you know, he's always lampooned. He says, I only have a certain amount of money. And it's just not like that. People need to have some sense of the basic literacy around economics. But there's a really important question in the chat about the rural farming community. And I think it's so important not to demonize them as we go forward. I mean, food and farming, as I tried to bring up yesterday, is an enormous problem globally. The global food systems are doing huge damage, but farming and food and agriculture are part of the solution as well. And that, we really, when we're talking about the kind of work that needs to be done, we need to be really promoting food and farming work on a small scale, agroecology, as really, really desirable for people to get into. And with a kind of better educated civil society, we need to be piling the pressure on politicians to do that, so that everything comes together. And that's, I suppose, many of us here would see ourselves as in those education, imagination, visionary roles, as well as doing all the coping and the hospicing work as well that I mentioned earlier. So I think we do need to be pushing for binding caps. For example, a cap on nitrogen, artificial nitrogen fertilizers, would really encourage diversification among farmers in Ireland and the shift towards a much smaller system. And we need to be really honest. I think people do need to panic a little bit. I mean, Greta Thunberg says, I want you to panic. We need to be I think people are either in denial or they simply don't know, but we need to be saying, we need to cut back on flights by about 90%. You know, people can't be flying all over the world. What sort of impact does that have on our tourist industry here, which relies on it so much? We've really got to be a bit more honest. We are honest among ourselves, but if you listen to any kind of discussion on economics on RTE, you will never hear any critique of growth. You won't even hear the simple question, what needs to shrink and what needs to grow? Yeah. But it's just, if we don't have growth, we can't keep going. It's really undifferentiated, indiscriminate growth is seen as the answer. So yeah, I think we have to keep on the educational field, and everyone here is doing that work. And as Sive says, it's a really, really tricky question.
Thank you. John, if I can come to you again, you've concerned Noel Bradley. Rise up. I presume it's rise up against the enemy, which is capitalism, etc. What about the enemy within each of us? Is there not a need to look at that, a personal challenge first, before we rise? I don't want a whole gang of people attacking state structures and institutions out of blind rage. So we do need to avoid our very own January 6th. How would you engage with that?
Well, I think it comes from an obvious, but it might be a mistaken view of radical change, that the only form of revolution we can think of is violent uprising. And I think that is not what I am advocating. But it is about the radical transformations that we will require in our systems. I mean, that's one thing I've taken away from this weekend, is that the importance of structural systemic change, in terms of the agricultural system or economic system, but that does not undermine the importance of individual action. My concern is that a lot of individual action focus essentially comes down to, well, if I can't change the world, I'll change myself. And I do think we have to be honest about that. And that, for me, the individual action that is often very depoliticized, is not connected with the bigger questions in our society, but can be fulfilling, need to be connected or viewed, in my view, as practices in a future that's already here, but it's unevenly distributed. I do not think salvation lies in mass community gardens or community supported agriculture. we absolutely will need those, I think, as living, tangible examples of the type of society we want to bring into being. But again, I'm like a broken record here, is that we cannot avoid large-scale political struggle. Now, what does that mean? For me, when I was a younger Marxist in the 1980s, there were a bunch of horrible capitalists. We were going to rise up with a revolutionary party and smash them. I was a member of the Workers' Party back then. And that is a simplistic and, I think, inappropriate view of the current situation that we're in. If I can mix metaphors, it's almost like viewing that what we're facing is a single problem with a tipping point, and we're going to usher in a different type of society. I think that what we're facing is like a degenerative disease. It's not going to be a thunderclap transition. And that therefore requires that any transformation, political, that I would certainly advocate, is about having a sense of stoicism, that we're not going to achieve these changes very easily. And that's why I think the language of pioneering, I put in the chat about, from a religious point of view, maybe it's about being John the Baptist. Those issues of thresholds that Anne pointed out is quite scary, because I'm amazed that, certainly for me now, as an academic, I've abandoned the traditional academic course of producing more and more books and articles. Younger colleagues like Sive absolutely need to do that. But for me, the world does not need another peer-reviewed article with Professor John Barry. It is this type of engagement at this time. I feel called, although, as many of you know, I'm probably one of the most ethical atheists that you'll ever meet in some respects. I feel called at this moment to engage with folk like yourselves to help us figure out. I don't have all the answers, but I do get concerned when we lapse back into this rather comforting individual, small-scale changes are going to do. We have to take state power. Who's that we? Of course, we can talk about it. We have to use the one organization that human societies have created in the course of our evolution. It's very new. The modern state is at most maybe 400 years old. For most of our evolutionary history, we've lived in anarchist type of societies, acephalous, no leaders, much more egalitarian and so on. The market system we have now is even more recent. Perhaps, we can say the current neoliberal globalized system is maybe at most 40 years old. So they're very, very new, and they are human creations. So that's what gives me hope, is that, these systems can be changed. But again, we cannot avoid political struggle. And I know that grates with many people, and why they have these images of negativity, of perhaps even violence. So maybe that's the wrong language to use. I don't know what other language to use in terms of the fundamental changes in every part of our lives that we're going to need in the coming decades ahead. It is, just to finish, it's the equivalent of the emergence of the Industrial Revolution. That's the scale of the challenges. But the problem is the Industrial Revolution emerged over a long period of time. We don't have that time. We don't have that time. We're running out of time. You read the science and you're not scared. You're not reading it correctly. And there is a debate, and I'll just throw it out there, as to whether telling people how serious it is, because my concern is that in the public media, even when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report comes out, and it is much worse than we think, I don't think that's really landed with most of our citizens, how absolutely perilous it is. And I'm a believer now that we don't sugarcoat that. Not everything that is faced can be overcome. We have to always hold out the possibility of failure. That's where hope comes from. That's why I'm not optimistic. Optimism is a lazy, happy thought that somehow things are going to work out okay. We're going to have to struggle to create a hopeful future. And therefore, that is the issue, is we ought to get busy struggling or we get busy dying, in my view.
Well, happy Sunday to you too. Thank you for that. I mean, and I don't disagree with you. I'm coming to Sean, and I know he has something to say on that, but I also have a question for you, Sean. And this is coming in from John McGeady. Is it possible to begin to imagine a different future without a memory of the past, a memory that things were different before and that the future could be different again?
The answer to John is, I think it's very clear. We have to know the history to know the future, or to sort of have any hope about the future and change and so on. But there is a huge amount of positive stuff to be learned from the history, because, as John Barry has been pointing out, and others, like change has happened before. Change has happened constantly throughout our history, and even in our own lifetimes, there have been major changes. Certainly, when I look at my own life, I see huge changes in that arc, if you like. Okay, I wanted to just add another comment, and this is why I was trying to get a response. In addition to what has been said already in response to Noel Bradley, because I think Noel raises a critically important point, and that is, I don't want either to be having people attacking structures and they're all out of blind rage. Forget that stuff. Like, life is hard enough without having that stuff going on as well. I think the critical issue for me in this is the kind of interaction that goes on between the internal journey and the external journey. Okay, and I think that it's important that they interact all the time, because I think in my own experience, I've seen a lot of people who recognize the importance of an inner journey, and they go on that. They like dealing, as Noel talks about, the enemy within. Okay, the problem is an awful lot of them finish with that, or they start to do small things, very small things, but they don't take aboard what John Barry is talking about, or what Tom is talking about as well. That, like, you need to engage with the economic system, you need to engage with the political system, and whether capitalism is dead or whether it's going to be around forever, I would totally agree with Tom and in the idea of universal basic services. And as he knows, I also advocate universal basic income. So for me, for Social Justice Ireland, putting those together give you a terrific base for a decent life, a just society, a just world moving forward. That's why we do so much promotion of it. But I think it's important to kind of recognize that it's an interacting process all the time. And that consequently, it's important as people go on that inner journey and deal with the enemy within, as Noel says, that they also face up and recognize the importance of engaging with the economic system, the political system, and operate at that level, if you like, insofar as they can. Okay. And Paddy O'Rourke has a good question there, just in terms of where, just an area I would point to that he has identified, which is around agriculture and farmers. Too often in Ireland, a whole lot of people are just demonizing farmers, as if in some way demonizing farmers is going to solve the problem. As Anne was saying, agriculture is part of the solution. It's not, while there are certainly huge problems, but we need to face up to also to the fact that we can't just tell, I was saying this yesterday, we can't just tell farmers, well, your traditional stuff is finished, so go and find something else. Like, I think we have to work with farmers to find viable futures in agriculture and outside it possibly too, for them. And I think that the point that Paddy is making is very valid, valuable, and needs to be incorporated into this kind of dialogue as well. So thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, John. I'm going to ask the next question of Tom, if I can, because while naturally I'd look to Sean for this one, because we've done a lot of work on the social contract recently, and certainly you've been doing it for decades, but it also ties in with a really brilliant piece that you had in one of your blogs, Tom. Obviously, many people are reasonably skeptical of the state. Can we make the transitions from a market society, which has commodified everything and requires growth, to one where people's needs are met without necessarily being employed, and where other work is valued without a growth in the scope and power of the state? I'm wondering about a return to commons and cooperatives, etc.
Yeah, no, for me, I think it's important that we kind of reconceptualize what the economy actually is. I mean, we have this, and the idea of GDP itself is part of the problem here. I mean, GDP was actually designed not to necessarily push an agenda, but as some kind of simple way to kind of measure what was going on around the time of World War II in terms of production and so forth. And unfortunately, it then became the Holy Grail. But I do think community projects, I do think different ways of working, are going to have to be part of the future. We do have this conception of 4-day weeks, 3-day weeks, flexible hours, working at home. This idea of salary man, 9 to 5 in the office, I think, is really unhelpful. And actually, the technological transformation of digitalization does allow us to move away from that, and that does reduce stress in terms of buying out your meals, your processed food, traveling to work, all of these things, and does allow us to kind of rebuild communities, because it allows us to come back and regenerate rural Ireland, for example, and rural places elsewhere, because you no longer have to all congregate en masse in this one place, thousands at a time, all coming in on your cars. You can go back to living where you wanted to live all along, but you can't because there are no jobs there. So there's a lot of hope there. And I think, look, we are seeing technological developments in terms of administration. It is becoming easier to have communities make more horizontal decision making, maybe not for every decision, but it is possible to do that, and to look at different ways of working and organizing. Certainly, obviously, from trade union perspective, they've always been long of the opinion that there's a role for cooperatives, and that there's a role for greater worker input into the decision making of their firms. And we're seeing in many cases, some of these really, really large firms are coming under pressure from below, from people that work in their organizations that are really uncomfortable with what they do. And I think that kind of advocacy and that kind of internal pressure and suasion is very, very important. So it is helpful to form organizations of like-minded people for religious, green, ethical, worker, whatever it might be, reasons, and to put that pressure on. And certainly I know from conversations with people from the business community, ESG, we might think of it as greenwashing or washing in various ways, but they say privately, look, that it is having an influence in some firms, and I think that but these concepts are only being tested now in the last decade, really. I mean, we're at the early stages, so I guess John talks about not being an optimist and it being about more about hope. Absolutely, there's no guarantee we will win. There's no guarantee we will keep it under 3 degrees or 4 degrees. We don't know, but we have to keep looking at these alternative models, piloting different things, trying new things, both in Ireland and elsewhere, seeing what works, constantly, iteratively evolving our ideas, being willing to throw everything at the wall and see what works, and to not be conservative and to try new things. Again, COVID showed us that there was a different way to do things, and it was successful and it worked. It was great. Then there ought be no going back to that. So we do need to move away from the old model. Just because it expanded the economy over a 50 to 100 to 200 year period doesn't mean it was the right way to do it or the only way to do it. And I think John made the point yesterday, or I think it was John, that actually the individual firms are not capitalist in terms of their organization at all. They're like little state companies. They're like little North Koreas, with a dictator at the top usually, and kind of feudal barons underneath, and everyone goes down to the people at the bottom who have no rights effectively. And so I guess the point is, we may be capitalists in some ways, but actually that's not how the economy really works. It's actually more of a corporatist model, really. Whereas various groups are lobbying in the political space for particular advantages and favor, which distorts the market, and unfortunately has massively distorted the market away from renewables, for example, and away from organic food and towards those industries that have been powerful and have been able to throw money at distorting the system. So we have to look at what people really, really want, and that is about articulating that vision. My predecessor, Tom Healy, he was very, very keen on the idea of articulating that vision, and he did so. Social Justice Ireland do the same, as do others here. And I think it is about having that dialogue with ourselves and about constantly putting pressure on. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the National Economic Dialogue tomorrow, because it'll be the first post-pandemic National Economic Dialogue. And it'll be really, really interesting to see if people's opinions about social insurance, universal basic services have changed. And look, I don't have all the answers. I think this is a process, and I think we need to keep pushing and keep engaging in ideas and seeing what works, and being open to trying different things. And the solutions for Ireland are going to be very, very different to the solutions in other places. We do have to remember that the standard of living is not high enough in most places of the world. Only a small proportion of humanity lives in the global north. So we also have to be looking at what are the solutions to uplift those groups in terms of their standard of living. And look, I certainly have some ideas about that, and I think there are things that can be done by the Fed and the European Central Bank and the UK Treasury in terms of producing bonds, which can be used to provide a green transition in those countries. And so there's more radical economic change that has to happen very quickly in those places. So you have the green dimension, but also the economic dimension in the economic in the sense of developing standards of living. So this is a multidimensional problem. There isn't a single solution to it. But crucial to it all is the idea of collegiality and countries working together and accepting that there's going to have to be losses. Anne has talked about the sectors that will have to decline. We need to be honest about that process. And as others have pointed out, in areas like agriculture and energy and so on, to show how you get to the other side, and having the security blankets in place that removes the fear from people in terms of getting from A to B in a very, very windy way over. Hopefully we can do it. I am optimistic. I know John doesn't like the word, but I think it is possible. But it's going to be very, very difficult.
Thank you so much for that, Tom. And I think, the point is well made, like no one person, no one organization has all the answers. And that's why it's so important to have events like this and other kind of dialogues where we can thrash these all out. I personally am in favor of having dialogues with people I don't agree with, because maybe there's a nugget that, can be made between the two. There's an excellent statement there in the comments by Anne. We also need to distinguish between standard of living and quality of life. And I think that's really important. And that's you could have the next year's summer school on that point alone, and how important it is. But if I can come back to that and come to Sive first, just for your feedback on everything that's been discussed and I suppose your approach to it.
Yeah, thanks. I was.
And if you can pick up your mic, please.
Yeah, the conversation is great. But I wanted to come back on one thing that John was saying about, we need a revolution or whatever. And it struck me that we need to be really honest about who we is. Who are we speaking for? Are we speaking for the enlightened ones who have this all figured out and just say we, seize the state, or more possibly and more realistically, manage to somehow organize to close down the fossil fuel industry locally or somewhere else? Justifying that to our communities is going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult. I think we do underestimate the levels of awareness in society, the levels of understanding. And I think if there was one thing that we could all agree on, perhaps, where all of these different approaches come together, is that we need to close down the fossil fuel industry. Now, John mentioned in the chat there, and I was going to ask him to do it because I'm actually on my phone and it's hard to use the chat box, to reference that book by Andreas Malm. It's a very, very important contribution to the kind of climate activist canon, because he's taking issue with some of the principles that have been adopted by Extinction Rebellion and, just taken as kind of, true, self-evident truths that you can't have any damage to property, essentially, that the most effective form of resistance is going to be peaceful and non-violent and won't involve damaging property. And he's not so much arguing for damaging or violence, but certainly for targeting property, forms of sabotage that would effectively limit the ability of the industry to carry on as business as usual. And if you know what we know, having read some of these IPCC reports, you would see that as an urgent political task. If there was a group that I could get involved in that is willing to do these things, I'd be all on for it myself, and aware of the legal complications and implications of that. The fossil fuel industry is driving us all to death, certain death. It's 3 degrees, as Tom said, is we're toast. There is no future. There's no equality or liberty or universal basic services in a 3 degree world. So we absolutely need to grapple with the urgency of climate breakdown and biodiversity loss as well. And I don't want to sound, I don't know what the word is. I'm just trying to appeal to you, I suppose, to not see these emergencies as things that can be parked and looked at and parsed and debated forever. They need action right now. We just don't have the time, and people are going to die. People are going to be suffering over the next year because of all the disruptions to the food supply caused by the Ukraine crisis and the loss in yields, which is also part of it, due to increasing drought and desertification in important crop growing areas of the world. And as countries start to become more concerned with their food supply, they are limiting exports. So for countries that are already vulnerable to food insecurity, the next couple of years is going to plunge them into deep crisis. And the only way we can address this is by agreeing to share what we have on some common basis, but at the same time limit the damage that the fossil fuel industry is doing. But as I said earlier, the fossil fuel industry isn't the only problem. We as consumers are consuming these products. And I think it is important to think about what it means in practice to distance oneself from, as much as possible, from the harms that industry causes. I was kind of intrigued as the chat box was coming up there with a little debate about personal is political. And from my personal point of view, working in climate policy and activism over the last 20 years, climate anxiety is a real thing. It can be crippling. It can paralyze you. It can bring deep distress to people. And part of that is that feeling of misalignment between one's values and the world outside, and also the way that we're living. So any conscious choices that we make to slow down, to change our diets, our lifestyles, to refuse to fly where possible, to make those small changes, to involve ourselves in community initiatives, can, I suppose, nourish and restore that part of us that's damaged by that misalignment and disconnect. So I think sometimes it's important to depoliticize things because it's just too bloody stressful to be politicized all the time about everything. However, I take the point that all of these struggles become very personal, and at the same time, it's too much for any individual to take on, that only collective action can, I suppose, achieve the kind of changes that we need at any level, however local it is, even on the street. And those are the things that also inspire us as human beings and give us hope in a way that our own individual actions might not. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks, Colette.
Thank you so much, Said. Thank you. There's a question, and if the panel here doesn't have the answer, but if there's anyone in the audience that has the answer, please do pipe up. It's by Isabel Smith. In November 2020 at a CC Young Economists, there was a streamed 3-day event looking at new economic models, and it undertook to bring forward this work through regional hubs and village hubs working on areas of concern. Has anyone an update on this direction initiated by Pope Francis? Anybody has any?
I'm not sure if it's an update, Colette, but just to say that Pope Francis did bring out an encyclical in 2015, Care of Our Common Home. And since then, it has mushroomed into a global movement. So now you have the Laudato Si movement, and there are 7 goals, and it has really, really taken a foothold. Also, Faith Invest is a global movement to get religious organizations to invest heavily in ecological or reinvest or not sell assets, primarily the land and their institutions, and to try and refurbish them or whatever. So the Laudato Si movement has become a global movement for which is affecting change And here in Ireland, Trócaire, and through the work of Jane Mellett and other activists, many parishes have actually divested of their investments in fossil fuels, which is it's a step in the right direction for sure. But I agree completely with Sive. It is really critical. The time has really run out, so we really have to try and stay hopeful and affect change where we can.
Just I can add a small piece, not in terms of the overall hub, but one of the proposals that Pope Francis made was that the Catholic Church members locally might discuss the issue of basic income, universal basic income. And I am part of a Catholic commission that is preparing a document on this for the bishops of England and Wales and Scotland. Unfortunately, the Irish aren't involved in it. But in fact, why I missed yesterday morning's session in this seminar was I was speaking at a symposium they organized yesterday in Oxford, and online, obviously, but there was a number of people gathered in Oxford to hear it as well. And I think that they will produce a study, a report, because one of the things they're doing is talking to people who disagree fundamentally with basic income, as well as to the advocates like myself. And they have, there's a kind of a core of about 10 or 11 people who are actually writing the thing, of which I'm one. But it should, in the coming months, produce a fairly substantial and I would hope fairly impactful report that could have impacts on UK politics, hopefully. We'll see how it goes. But it's just a step in the right direction. Interestingly enough, in terms of the discussion we've been having and about trying to think in terms coming up from the base rather than down from the top, the proposal originally from Pope Francis was addressed to the new movements. And he wanted them, and still wants them to engage with two critical issues as he sees it: the future of work and the issue of basic income, or some way to resolve the issue of, if you change the meaning of work, you are then fundamentally fundamentally changing how you distribute income in the system. So you need to get at an alternative, and he's talking about universal basic income as a possible way that they need to look at and think about and come back maybe with some ideas on whatever. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will go to my final question before I ask John to wrap up completely. But back to you, and just on that point between the distinction between quality of life and a standard of living, just even your thoughts on it at this point.
My self-educated economic literacy thoughts on it, and I am self-educated. Yeah, I mean, standard of living is generally thought of the amount of material goods that we possess, all the stuff that we have. And for so long, it was seen that the more stuff we could accumulate, the higher our standard of living. The more cars, the more washing machines, the more houses, I got yachts. I can't think of all the things that people like to have, but I don't need to do that. And that, and then on the other hand, and that's really just a very quantitative, accumulative measure of a standard. And then there's the much more qualitative way of looking at the quality of people's lives, which is all about the relationships, meaning, the things that make life really worthwhile. And I mean, people actually readily recognize that. It's not, it's not a big philosophical concept, but nevertheless, it's one worth really hammering home very often. And also, I think if people really do understand now that you can accumulate too much stuff, and for a start, so much of that is it comes from far away, or it's generated in ways that harm the earth or that harm other people. It doesn't internalize its full social and ecological cost. And also that just from a personal point of view, if you own too much stuff, it weighs you down. You spend too much time looking after it or maintaining it, or just you have clutter. So I suppose the whole voluntary simplicity movement revolved around that notion of the distinction between standard of living and quality of life. And I know that everyone here could add to that discussion, so I'll keep it simple there.
Thank you so much, Anne. And final word to yourself, John, just to wrap up this panel discussion. If you could, I'm going to ask you if you could do it in 3 words, but if you could.
Oh, I could do it in 3 words: educate, agitate, organize, as I put into the chat, if you want to boil it down to the pure drop, as it were. But perhaps I can make just some other comments based upon this morning and yesterday. And it's one again that has come up, is what is our theory of change? You know, Saib is absolutely correct, and Sean and Tom and Anne, all looking at that issue of strategy. You know, as I think I put in the chat there, it's not that we are outnumbered, we're out-organized. You know, the people who are presiding over the ecocidal rivet popping of our life supporting systems are very well organized. They meet in Davos, they meet in golf courses. So while I absolutely accept what Tom is saying, that some people in power, in business and so on, it is a matter of genuine ignorance, that they don't know what it is they're doing. I think when it comes to the fossil fuel industry, they know perfectly well. They are betting on rivet popping the life supporting systems of the planet, and we have to recognize that. It may be uncomfortable. So I'd absolutely agree with Saib. If we want to have one enemy, and they are an enemy because they are destroying life, it is the fossil fuel industry. Now, that's very complex. I'm currently in industrial dispute with my employer, as our colleagues across the UK education sector, about our pensions being stolen. But my pension is invested in fossil fuels, despite a campaign that many of us had. So when we say we need to decommission the fossil fuel industry, it's not just BP, Shell, Exxon Mobil, and so on. It is the connections then to things like pensions. So it's quite a complex issue. I do want to provocatively suggest that for many of us, and I speak against myself, is that there's almost like a Saint Augustine moment here. Oh Lord, make us sustainable, but not just yet. And I think that's a natural reaction, because the challenge and the opportunity and the types of changes that will be needed are going to be very, very significant. You know, it could be presented in a language of sacrifice, a reduction in our standards of living. I don't use that language because I don't think it necessarily has to be. It's not a very enticing way to get people to support you, but it is a very different type of life. You know, if I could summarize some of the comments and discussions we've had, it is about the relocalizing of food and energy in particular. It's about selectively deglobalizing our economy. It is about issues of food and energy sovereignty, not just food and energy security, but actually sovereignty. It is about, you know, reducing formally paid employment in some ways, whether it's a 3 or 4 day working week. It's about valuing the unpaid work in our homes and in our communities. It is about, in my view, questioning the kind of childlike emperor has new clothes situation that we're in. Let's just call out the nonsense that passes for educated commentary in the media, you know, in perhaps boardrooms or meetings that people here may have. And I do absolutely accept, I think it was the point that Tom made, that those personal one-to-one contacts are really important. Yes, we can have discussions like this and big plenary debates, but I think we need to bring our whole selves, and it's unfortunate, of course, in some ways it's a very low carbon way for us to interact, but it's a very, you know, two-dimensional at best experience. I do think it is about resonating with people on an emotional level. And as I shared with many of you yesterday, I'm very comfortable now as an alpha male professor to talk about my emotional concerns that I do fear at times for my children's future. I do cry, you know, and I think that process of publicly acknowledging the grief, not just for the reasons that Colette so beautifully outlined this morning, we should be grieving for the more than human world that we have willingly and knowingly destroyed. We are now living through the 6th great mass extinction event. But also for me, I'm grieving for ways of life for my children that are no longer possible. You know, and that is a process of letting go. So I think a lot of what we have to do is to let go of embedded assumptions. I definitely think we need an analysis of ideology, the power of a particular view of the good life and a good society that we see propagated, particularly in our media. The Irish Times just drives me to distraction. It's a bit like watching Fox News in terms of the narrative being repeated in terms of a fairly orthodox way that the solution to our crisis is more growth, maybe green growth. I just think we need to start being more honest and having the courage of, as I say, like that fable of the emperor has no clothes, of having that childlike simplicity to say, forgive the language I'm going to use, this is bullshit. You know, this is absolute nonsense. And let's just call it out for what it is. We should also let go, and this is very difficult for somebody like me, that we have all the solutions. You know, I do think it is about honestly saying we recognize the problem, but we don't know what necessarily the solutions might be. I think we've touched the edges of the outlines of a potential sustainable, regenerative, low carbon economy here. But we have to be honest, particularly those of us in the education sector and research, we don't have all the answers. I think these issues will have to be co-created, and it look very different in Belfast, Boston, Berlin, Beijing. I'm running out of B's. That there is no, one size fits all solution to what it is that we're facing. I suppose a final set of reflections I would relate, and particularly the importance of faith communities at this moment of crisis and opportunity, is a fundamental recognition that the crisis we're facing is a crisis of meaning. It's as much a cultural crisis as a crisis of meaning, and it's not just a crisis of means. In other words, the earth being viewed as objects in terms of Colette. The kind of scientific, orthodox, even economic way of looking at things is, well, because we're dependent upon the earth for resources, there's a crisis of means. The climate crisis is effectively, we're running out of using the earth as a sewer. That's effectively what the climate crisis is. But I do think fundamentally below that is a crisis of meaning. And of course, that is a wonderful opportunity for faith communities, because this is your shtick. This is the thing that you do, to be giving meaning to people's lives. And there's a lovely book. If there's only one book you care to read about on the climate crisis, it's from, actually, he's a Christian and also a socialist, so at least I share one thing with him, is a man called Mike Hume. And he wrote a beautiful book, maybe just over 10 years ago, called Why We Disagree About Climate Change. Why We Disagree About Climate Change. And it's probably the best book I've come across that, it's pretty light on the science, although he's an eminent climate scientist. But it's about the stories he tells in the book in terms of narratives to understand the climate crisis. And he has a wonderful quote. And he says, what we need to do is not see what we can do for the climate. It's a kind of very male-centered, solutions-focused, maybe tech approach. It's not that. So the issue is not what we can do for the climate, that we can fix the climate. It's the opposite. What's the climate doing for us? What are the cultural, ethical, political opportunities that the crisis we're now in is affording us in terms of changing views of good life, changing our society? So again, it's not what we can do for the climate, it's what the climate is doing for us. And I do think, if I could summarize in 4 parts, that for me, our discussions are all based around justice. Justice for those yet to be born, future generations. Justice for those members of the human family in other parts of the world who are already dying and having blighted lives as a result of the planetary crisis. So it's global justice. It's also justice in the here and now in terms of members of our own society who are lacking the necessities that they need. And then finally, this is definitely a tip of the hat to Colette's presentation this morning. It's also moving beyond the species barrier. It is also justice to the more than human world. So I leave it there.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent summation of everything that's gone on in the last day and a half. And so very, very grateful to you, John. Thank you so much. Thank you to Professor John Barry, to Sister Colette Kane, to Dr. Sean Healy, to Dr. Anne Ryan, to Dr. Tom MacDonald, and to Professor Saib O'Neill for today's panel discussion. It was brilliant. And thanks to everybody who gave comments or questions or feedback through the chat function as well. That was fantastic, and it really added to the quality of what we saw this morning.